Good afternoon. Welcome to the last session of the 2023 Justice Center Summit, Investigating Injuries of Unknown Origin. I'm Davin Robinson, the Deputy Director of the Office of Outreach, Prevention, and Support here at the Justice Center, and I'll be serving as your MC today. I want everyone to know that this session is being recorded. We'll be posting this on our website, and we will send everybody slides after the conclusion of the session, probably tomorrow. So you'll get all that information. If you have to miss a part of it, don't worry, it'll still be available for you. We'll also be sending you an evaluation, and we hope that you will take the time to fill it out and let us know what you'd like to see next year, suggestions for improvement. We really value your input. So before we begin, I would like to do some Zoom housekeeping. As it says in the chat, this is a webinar, and as webinar participants, you are all off camera and your microphones are muted. That does not mean we don't want your questions. So you please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation by using the chat function. We'll be monitoring it, and when there are breaks, we will ask those questions at that time. So please use those. There are, if you've never used Zoom before, you find all of the setting buttons by going to the bottom of your Zoom screen and hover over it, and you'll see the chat function. You'll also see a reactions bar or reactions icon, and that is just we ask you if you feel strongly about something, you really like what you're hearing, or something else. Use an emoji. Let our presenters know that thank you very much that you're awake and paying attention. Closed captioning is also available. If anybody would like that, all you have to do is click on that. Again, these sessions are being recorded, and you will receive the slides at the end of the session, so you don't need to worry about that. So now, without further ado, I will leave you in the capable hands of Sarah Delmarter to begin the presentation.
Thanks so much. I want to welcome you all. We're always so excited to provide this presentation because we've created a framework for tackling injury of unknown origin investigations and inquiries that make them manageable, and we're happy to share that information. And I say injury of unknown origin inquiries because you can use these skills to look into non-reportable injuries, significant reportable incidents, or abuse neglect cases. So keep that in mind as we go through. We first crafted this training for Justice Center abuse neglect investigators, but we soon learned that you could just be starting to look into an injury that may not even seem reportable at some stage, at the stage you're at, and this could still be very useful information. I'd like to introduce my co-presenter. Carrie Perfetti works with the Office of General Counsel, and I work with the Office of Investigations in the Mortality Review Unit. And we're part of a steering committee that took a special interest in injury of unknown origin a few years ago. And it started out as training for our investigators. It led into developing job aids and guidance documents on specific injuries and injury evaluations. And now it's blossomed into sharing what we've learned as best practices with providers. So with that, I'll get us started. So today we will define an injury of unknown origin. We're going to discuss the investigative challenges that come with these cases. They are unique. We're going to talk about a preponderance of evidence, and what I mean by that, where your end goalposts are. Where are you trying to get at the end of this look behind into this injury? We're going to talk about the 5 alternative hypotheses for an IUO or injury of unknown origin inquiry. What are the 5 possible solutions or 5 outcomes that can help you bring this investigation or inquiry to a closure? And last, we're going to talk about 3 strategic components of a successful IUO inquiry. We're going to talk about the 3 pieces of a puzzle that, if you collect all 3 of them thoroughly, will move you down the field and towards those goalposts. So the first important concept is defining an injury of unknown origin. I think there's a myth that an injury of unknown origin is just any mystery injury. There's an injury where it wasn't witnessed, we don't know how it happened. But I want to make it so clear that for an injury of unknown origin to truly be something that you're going to do an inquiry in, not witnessed is a component, but there's more to it. It also can't be reasonably explained, and it raises suspicion. What's so important is, regardless of how severe the injury is, Does this injury that no one's really quite sure how it happened give you a gut feeling that if it were your loved one, you really need it looked into to figure out how it happened? Did seeing the injury make you ask, how the heck could this have happened? Did looking at the injury or learning about the injury or getting a report of the injury make you think, this just wasn't likely that knowing this person and what they did yesterday and how they go through the course of their day, that they could have just gotten this by unsuspicious reasons? So I think it's so important that when you develop a framework for incident management and you're looking at injuries of unknown origin as a type of incident worth your resources, the unwitnessed is one component. Can't be reasonably explained when you start to ask questions about how you think this happened. And then there's something about that injury that raises suspicion. A chipped tooth and a black eye might raise suspicion. A broken pinky might not. We're going to talk about some situations where either one of those may or may not be suspicious. But to start from a framework, a standing point of an injury of unknown origin, recognizing that the definition really requires all three of these components to be what we consider an injury of unknown origin. So we know these investigations can be hard. Here at the Justice Center early on, we saw Justice Center and state oversight agencies and providers struggle. They would interview everyone who interacted with an individual a day, a week, 2 weeks, a month sometimes back, and ask them what they saw and did they know how this happened. And at the end of a lot of resources expended, more often than not, the investigation closed with, we have an injury of unknown origin. And a few of us pulled together because we were so interested in this, and we challenged ourselves, could we come up with a framework to give tools or to give a recipe for how to do this type of investigation, how to put the puzzle together in a way that might get better outcomes? Because the ultimate outcome, learning how the injury happened, is a useful outcome. Being able to learn that abuse or neglect probably didn't cause it is a great feeling. Learning that it did and being able to act on it is also valuable. And sometimes learning the ways that the injury could have happened could lead to systemic changes. But back in the early days, the challenges were many. You don't have a date or time for when the incident occurred. You don't have a starting point for your investigation. It's not like another investigation. You don't have a specific person who is alleged to have done something or a breach in duty or an event that caused it. You don't know who your witnesses are. You don't have an obvious subject that was alone with the person at a certain date and time and only they could have done it. So there's no smoking gun in these cases, but even beyond that, there's no specific allegation to investigate. And these things can be hard, but as we move through this presentation, we're hoping that everyone will walk away with some new tools to do these a little differently. I'm going to hand it over to Carrie to talk about preponderance.
So thank you, Sarah. And as Sarah mentioned, these cases, I think, are really important cases to look at because usually all you end up with is knowing there's an injury, and it takes a lot of work to really look at what can you learn from that. But looking at preponderance, I think that's the standard that we use in all of our cases. And usually there's an actual allegation. And so you're using that preponderance to look, do I have enough support to say that a specific subject committed neglect or committed physical abuse? Where in injuries of unknown origin, we really look at the preponderance a little bit differently. And we're really looking to establish what more likely than not occurred that caused this injury of unknown origin. And I think, Lisa, if you could advance the slides, it seems to not be working for me as well. So that's really your goal in looking at these cases, is to inquire to see if you can describe and explain what more likely than not occurred. And you're going to get a lot of good tools today on how to do that. So when you start with just the injury itself, what tools can we give you or approaches can we give you that can help you try to identify what more likely than not might have occurred that caused this injury? And you can go to the next slide.
I think that's such an important point, Carrie. I think as investigators early on, we found that investigators thought their job was to prove what happened. And we're asking the investigation to come to a likely cause. And that's a different bar that's being set. There's room for you to say at the end of an investigation, I think it's more likely than not that so-and-so's bumped their knee unwitnessed during the course of their normal day, than saying, I know that it happened at this date, at this time, in this hallway.
And I think, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. I think part of the strategy in doing this too is, and we're going to talk about the 5 possible hypotheses, is sometimes in order to get to what more likely than not occurred, it comes with ruling out some of your other hypotheses. So I think injuries of unknown origin are as much as trying to rule in with support as much as it is ruling out some things you might think could have caused it. And so the 5 alternative hypotheses we really looked at as potentially being the source or the cause of this injury would be medical. Could the injury be explained by some sort of medical condition? And I know there are some medical rashes that might mimic burns. So looking to see, is this a potential cause? With osteoporosis, is the injury or a fracture, is it pathologic in nature, or was it the result of some type of trauma? And a lot of times, obviously, that ruling that in or out is going to be very dependent on getting a medical opinion or speaking to a medical professional. The next one is no fault injury. Again, going to what Sarah said, the injury should raise some sort of suspicion. If an individual is independent in ambulation and has a level of supervision where they don't have to have eyes on at all time, and they show up with an injury on their shin, could it be possible that just in the normal course of their everyday activities and walking around, they banged their leg while walking and, it's really considered a no-fault injury? But going with that, and I think you'll get a lot more information on that, you'd also want to make sure that the injury description matches that. So you have an injury that's consistent with somebody walking and hitting their leg, and based on their level of independence, that makes sense. So is it a no-fault injury? The next hypothesis might be neglect or inattention. Was there a failure of somebody to attend to a person or to follow their prescribed level of care? A lot of ways you look at that is, was there an injury of unknown origin and the level of supervision of the individual was such that if you were providing it, you would have had to have known how this injury occurred. So the fact that you don't almost sort of lends you to the fact that somebody must have breached supervision. Another good place where this might come in is looking at the person's transfer status and transfer plans. Could this injury be attributed to somebody not following proper transfer protocols? And again, it's looking to see what more likely than not could have led to this injury based on all of the different tools and tactics and strategies we're going to give you. The next one would be, can we rule in that this injury is more likely than not inflicted by another individual? And I think really important to look at is, and something we've really had to stress internally is, if it is more likely than not inflicted, are we able to determine if it was more likely than not inflicted by another individual receiving services, or would it be more likely than not inflicted by a staff member providing care? And then the final one is really, we've done everything we could do. We've used our tools. We've looked at the 3 different categories that we're going to give you. And we really can't rule in or rule out any one of the hypotheses of what more likely than not occurred. And our injury still just remains an injury of unknown origin. And sometimes that is where you are going to end up. But I found that really by looking and implementing the tools and the tactics that we're going to give to you today, you really are able to get to one of the other 4 causes of what really more likely than not caused this injury. And we can go to the next slide. So we found that 3 strategic components for a successful injury of unknown origin inquiry or investigation that help you develop really reliable information is first profiling the injury. And what do we mean by that? In another training I've heard the injury is your star witness. At the point in time when you have one of these cases, that's really the only thing that you know. You know there's an injury, you know maybe what the injury looks like, you might have some characteristics of the injury. So what is it that this injury can tell us? And you can get information from that by speaking to nurses, physicians, doing some information. I remember Sarah always saying Google is your friend. Sometimes if you have medical records and Googling what the diagnosis is, it can really give you some good information on the injury itself. Developing the victim's risk profile. And the best way I've ever heard anybody explain this is finding out who is John Smith. And that's really the best way of thinking of what is a victim's risk profile. What are their plans say? What is their background information? What is their routine like? What is their environment like? And through doing that, you're going to identify things that potentially could have led to this injury. And then the third important thing is interviewing timeline witnesses. And I think it's very important when we're interviewing timeline witnesses is to know the things that we want to ask them. I think sometimes we get interviews of, do you know how this injury occurred? No. Okay, move on. Well, if all you had to ask was, do you know how the injury occurred? And everybody said, sure, I know, this is what happened. We wouldn't have injuries of unknown origin because people would tell you right away what happened. So it's looking at what other things can we ask these timeline witnesses that can help us give us a clue as to what potentially the cause of this was or what more likely than not occurred.
Harry, a question came up in the chat about witnesses. If it's an explainable but unwitnessed injury, how would you determine a witness pool to talk to?
That's a great question, Devin. I think as we go into interviewing timeline witnesses, we're going to go into detail there. For the person who asked and for anyone who's considering the same question, the quick answer until we move on to that particular section is if you work backwards from discovery, that's probably the least overwhelming and the most productive way to go. So you start with the person who reports the injury. What did you see? When did you see? And how did you see it? And then you work backwards and see what you learn each step of the way. So the timeline becomes so important to developing the witness pool.
And the next slide, I think there's two tools that we have developed that we find are very helpful in looking at these injuries. And the first is the injury of unknown origin, what we call elements worksheet. And it really kind of helps force the analysis of what did you learn about the injury? What did you learn about the timeline? What things did you find out that help you rule in or rule out a medical condition? So let's say, you're thinking possibly that there's something that looks like a burn and you're thinking, oh, it might be this medical condition. Well, you go and speak to a physician and they rule that out for you. We can rule out that it was a medical condition. So now you're left with, okay, let me look at my other buckets to see if I can figure it out. So this worksheet really, I believe, helps you rule in and rule out all those different theories. And I believe the worksheets are being put into the chat for your use. The other worksheet is exactly what Sarah had mentioned, and it's just a worksheet that helps you do the timeline and work backwards from the date and time that the injury first was identified, all the way back to the date that you can actually verify that there was no injury there. So those two things become really important, trying to figure out quantifiably, if you can get somebody to tell you, yes, I saw the individual, I would have had the opportunity to see this injury on such and such a date, and no, I did not see it. Because then that gives you your sort of two bookends as far as your timeline of when you're looking at. And that helps to set your reference if you can get those 2 time points.
I use the timeline worksheet if I'm the investigator, but I've also used it to help me understand the evidence if I'm reviewing an investigation someone else has. Because the narratives of all the people they talk to and what they did or didn't learn can become overwhelming. I really want to build the timeline if the investigator didn't do it. And I found I'll leave a couple blank above me and I'll start a couple lines down, because sometimes you want to go a little bit past the injury so that you can learn what the doctor diagnosed, or whether the follow-up visit identified if there was bone healing or something like that. So I'll often start on the worksheet a couple down, and your first line on your worksheet is the date and time it was first reported. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. And what did they do? Did they make a phone call and say something? Did they measure something? Did they take a photograph? What did they see? And then you start to work back to, well, okay, so it was reported at 9 by the person who was getting the person ready for their shower, but the schedule shows that someone else got them up at 6 a.m. to take their meds. that might be the next person I need to talk to. And you slowly work back in time from when it was last not seen. So the point in time when no one reported this injury to when it was discovered. So we threw a bunch of things at you. We threw 3 key areas for your investigation: profiling the injury and profiling the victim's risks, and then the timeline. So we're going to take a little bit more time telling you what we mean by each of these concepts. Profiling the injury can be very important to understanding where your investigation needs to go, which of the 5 hypotheses you can rule out, which are starting to feel more likely. Some of the mistakes I've seen in profiling the injury is accepting 1 or 2 snapshots of what that injury is. Staff identified a bruise on the hip that appeared large. They called the nurse, and now you have this nurse document that says it was a 6 by 7 centimeter blue-green bruise, and those might be the only 2 pieces of information you have on it. But if there's anything else that can be captured, you need to keep going. So we're going to talk about all the different things that might help you profile the injury a bit better. The injury is your star witness. Where you are lacking in witnesses and people who can say, I was there when it happened, the injury really now becomes your most important witness. So you want to collect all available evidence surrounding the noted injury at its discovery and how it progresses over time. So you even want to collect bump and bruise forms and body check sheets that show no injury. You want to collect or prove there are no staff accident or other individuals in the homes that have injuries from the same date and time. You want to understand if the person receives medical care, what EMS documented about the injury, what the hospital documented about the injury. Because one piece might give you a detail about that injury that nothing else did. I've seen many an investigation where a fracture is simply referred to as a femur fracture, and we don't have any more details. But if we're able to get the details of where on the femur it broke, what type of force may have caused it, sometimes is hinted at, whether it's a complete fracture or an incomplete fracture, whether it's a spiral. There's so many different ways that medically that a fracture is described, that getting those specific details of the injury, if it's overlooked, you've lost evidence. And if you collected it, you might not know what it means, but as Carrie referenced earlier, when Google becomes your friend, you learn. We've learned a lot about fractures and burns and rashes over the years by learning, the exact location, size, shape, and the different medical technical terms that are used, because they might hint at what type of force it might have taken for the injury to happen. So hospital records, don't just get that discharge summary. If there's a inpatient record or an ER record where the radiologist or the x-ray tech or the orthopedist really gave specific details, they might help you describe and explain how that injury occurred. As I said, rule out additional victim injuries. Are there other injuries on the victim that are suspicious? And now you have a constellation because the group. So a fractured arm might get all of the attention in the ER visit, but that nursing check before they went to the ER might have also included a bruise to the cheek. The bruise to the cheek might not even be mentioned in the hospital record because it didn't require treatment from them. But now you know in your investigation that you have additional injuries. Likewise, if there are no additionals, you really want to rule it out. There's some information that can really support whether something was more likely than not accidental or inflicted. But when you're trying to compare a story to injuries, if injuries are on both sides of the body as opposed to one side of the body, it might not be consistent with a fall that was your original hypothesis. So it's so important to clearly identify that there is not a full constellation of injuries, or if there is, that you don't forget any of the other injuries, no matter how minor they might seem. If they appeared to happen at the same time, they're relevant. Using that information, no, please go back. Using that information, you might need a nursing or professional medical opinion to help you understand the force required. Once you start to collect those descriptions of those fractures or those burns or those bruises, you might be able to now get an educated interview with a specialist who can explain whether it might have been spontaneous, incidental, or traumatic. And what I mean by that, spontaneous means that certain people with certain medical conditions, with certain types of activity, could get a fracture spontaneously. You know, you could have someone with severe osteoporosis who could roll over in bed and fracture a hip. You could have someone who could incidentally bruise very easily. And you could find that your injury is something that a medical professional will say, they could not have fallen from standing. They would have had to have fallen from a height. This is the type of injury we see in a car crash. Being able to have those interviews because you've got a clear understanding of the injury can really make or break how much further you're going to be able to get in the case. And then last, I mentioned it briefly, but rule in or out whether or not your staff were injured, whether or not other folks were injured, because your hypotheses do include two people making contact with each other in an unsafe way. If you think that's a more likely than not hypothesis, there could be injuries on other people. Some of the things that you can collect: photographs over time. Snap a picture, keep a photo log. This picture was taken of this body part on this date at this time, and it shows this. Incident and accident reports, anything that was written about the injury, anything and everything that was written about the injury. Proof that reports weren't filled out when they should have been. Any residential notes that either show the person was well and without injury, or that start to hint at the injury, or that may hint at, you know, what their day had been like. Any statements that staff have given about what they saw, how they witnessed the injury, how they came about to find it, when they found it, when they reported it. If 911, police department, or EMS have documented anything about the injury. Any medical records or diagnostic tests. Medical and nursing interviews are often very helpful. You're not asking the doctor or the nurse, do you think abuse caused this? You're literally asking them, hey, here's everything I learned about this injury or this constellation of injuries. Can you tell me what type of force it would take? You know Susan, you know what meds she's on, you know her diagnosis. Could she just bruise like this from normal care? She's a 2-person lift. Staff are trained to put their hands here and to lift her. Could this bruise just happen that way? Those are the types of questions that nursing and medical will be more able to help you understand the seriousness or the suspiciousness of the injury than just outright asking them if they think they're indicators of abuse. And as we've mentioned before, Google, there are going to be terms you don't know. Look them up.
Yeah, and I just want to go and stress what Sarah, like the medical interviews that I see in cases, especially ones that are done in the Justice Center, are so valuable in helping to understand the potential causes of these injuries. Things like, you know, a medical record, when you look at it, a lot of times will indicate trauma. Well, I think that's a very sort of big term. It could mean, you know, incidental bumping into something versus like a significant amount of force and trauma. So especially probably in providers, you have those better relationships with the physicians who are involved in the care versus somebody random just calling. You know, really rely on those relationships to see if you can speak to, you know, a primary care physician about, you know, what types of force do you think might have caused an injury like this. They tend to be really very helpful in determining whether these are suspicious or not, and or, you know, whether you have something really that you need to follow through and look at, or is it really consistent with the next piece, which I'm going to talk about, which is the individual's risk profile. So this is very important as another piece, or another one of the buckets, as we like to call it. And developing the victim's risk profile also can be thought of as really trying to figure out and really understand who is John Smith, or who is the individual that has this injury of unknown origin. You can go to the next slide. There's a lot of things that you're going to look at to determine this, plans, protocols. One thing I want to mention that we always caution people about is I think people are quick to jump to the fact that if somebody has an injury of unknown origin and also has a background with self-injurious behavior, that they automatically link it and say, well, they have this injury, they have self-injurious behavior, that must have been the cause, it must be self-inflicted. I think one thing you really want to make sure that you're looking at is the injury consistent with the known manifestation of the self-injurious behavior? So if an individual's typically has self-injurious behavior that consists of maybe, you know, hitting themselves on the hand, and now they have a black eye, those two really don't match up. And so I don't think you really can say that the self-injurious behavior can explain away this injury possibly. So you really want to look at, what are the plans? How do they typically manifest? Is the injury consistent with that before sort of putting that as your likely hypothesis? An SIB injury could also be attributed to some sort of no-fault injury. It could be neglect. It could be related to oversight needs. So if we do say it is contributed to their self-injurious behavior, again, that doesn't automatically say, well, we don't have any kind of abuse or neglect here. What is the individual's plan? Should they have been on some level of oversight that could have prevented this or should have prevented this? Or that somebody should have been able to know for sure that this was the likely cause of this injury. And it's really important to understand service needs and your service environment. And what are some of the things to look at, or some of the tools or things you can do to do this? One is really record review. When I'm reviewing a case in OGC, when it's already come in, plans are very important to me. That's the first thing I always look at. Can I understand the supervision needs of this individual? What are the next thing I always look at? Are they ambulatory? Do they need any kind of assistance with transfer? Do I know what the safe patient handling needs are? Do I know what the policies of the agency are? Should transfers happen with one person? Should they happen with two people? What are the individual's medical conditions and treatments? What is their history of both self-inflicted injury? And I do think, and I think I saw it come up in the chat, what is their sort of history of possibly injuries of unknown origin? I think where the history comes in, there's a lot of places history comes in, but I'm going to talk about it specifically for trying to determine what more likely than not occurred. Has there been a similar injury in the past that you really did identify what the potential cause was? And, does that give you any clue? Because now you're seeing this injury happen over, and it is more likely than not that you've already identified it. What is the accident history and what is the injury history? All these things become really important in looking. A lot of times we'll have people go back and grab some internal incident reports over a period of time to see, was there sort of something indicating what this possible cause could be. The next thing that I think is the absolute most valuable is observations. Doing observations of the individual in their relevant service environments, knowing how, what is the routine of the person? What is the routine of the person in the time period that they obtained the injury, you identified it? Weekends can look very different than weekdays. So knowing what that sort of schedule looks like for each individual is important. Tracing them through their environment, if during the week, maybe they're doing some different programs at different providers, a day hab, a residential program, they're on a transportation vehicle. Observing the individual in that environment can be very helpful in identifying environmental factors that could have potentially caused this injury. Some of the best investigations that we see, right out, I went to this environment and I observed the individual in their environment. While I was there, I watched them maybe knock into the table 4 times, which is at the exact height that this injury was. That can be very helpful in identifying what the potential cause of this injury could be. Looking at any kind of adaptive or durable medical equipment, observing somebody, if we think possibly patient lifting or safe patient handling could be a potential cause, observing a lift, watching people actually do a lift with the individual to say, oh, when they're lifting, I noticed that this part of the lift lines up exactly with where the injury might have occurred. That can help you either rule in and or don't forget rule out those as potential causes. Conversations, asking people, and when you're doing your timeline witness, again, talking about not saying, do you know how the injury occurred, but asking, was there anything unusual that happened in the days leading up to this injury being discovered? Did the individual vary from the routine at all? Did you notice them being more quiet, possibly not eating as much? Anything that can give you an indication of did their behavior change from the standard or from the norm that might help you then identify the time period when the injury might have actually occurred. And then follow-up record requests. As you start looking, you might have one theory in mind and then you might rule that out and now another one comes up, but making sure that you get the records that support that. Other things that I find really important in profiling the risk is if somebody does have a behavior plan, and we do think possibly their behavioral background could have led to this, getting the record of the behaviors observed in a time period, seeing, did anything happen? Do I have any documented behavior that could be consistent with this injury? So not ending in, they have a background in this, but then also looking at records that can say, but was this observed in the period of time that the injury could have occurred? I think is also very important. And when you're looking at observation of the service environment, things like observing the individual's behavior and movements in that specific environment, observing social interactions and activities, looking at the environment, do you see anything in the environment that potentially could be a risk? Unsecured items that might be there that could have caused the injury, and items that match the pattern, size, and shape of the injury. And I think this is something that we have gotten really good at looking at. Can we identify any kind of pattern or shape? And do we see anything in the environment that matches that can then give us a likely theory of how this injury might have occurred and or potentially been inflicted?
Okay, and our third concept, interviewing timeline witnesses. When we talked about the timeline worksheet, we talked about starting from discovery. And you start with the person who discovered and reported, and you work backwards. And you might find there was a slightly earlier discovery, but the person wasn't really sure what they saw. They just saw some redness, or maybe they didn't see the injury, but the person was already starting to be fussy or uncomfortable. And it might be a hint that the injury was already there. Talking to medical people might tell you that injury had to have been there at least 2 weeks because there was some calcification on the bone at the x-ray, which means healing is already started. So maybe profiling the injury has helped change your timeline. And then you're going to use your timeline to talk to the people that interacted with your victim in the spaces that they were in during that timeline. And I think prior to doing this training, it was a whole lot of canvassing. Did you see anything? Do you know how this injury could have happened? Is there anybody that gives you a gut feeling that might have abused the person? And more often than not, you got no, 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 right? Because if they had seen it, they'd have reported it. And nobody wants to speculate. Or maybe they do want to speculate and it's a red herring. But what we found instead was that there's some real techniques to interviewing the timeline witnesses that might get you more valuable information. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. So when we talk about timeline witnesses, we're talking about folks that fit within the time frame you're investigating, starting with discovery, who you can sit down with and conduct an investigation about the period of time they interacted with the person to find out what they do know. That is so much more valuable. They do know whether the person acted their self at dinner, whether they ate, whether they, red herring, great question. I'll jump in with that. A rabbit trail or a bunny hole or something that gets you off on the wrong track. Sorry about that. So instead of asking people what they think caused the injury, you're instead going to say, Jane, I see that you worked with Samantha from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. You were assigned to her. Can you tell me about when you came on shift? Oh, I came in 15 minutes early. I know I did because I brought the overnight staff her favorite coffee from Dunkin' Donuts. And the first thing I did was I went into the office to check the assignment sheet. And then and you walk them through what they did and what they saw and what they heard and what they remember. And they may have valuable information for you. They may remember that the person was slower to wake up or was laying facing away from folks when they arrived in the door, or didn't eat breakfast, or seemed groggy, or seemed a little more teary-eyed, or walked differently, but they thought their foot was just asleep. You start to gain information that may help you put the pieces of the puzzle together later. Now, they may tell you, I'm not sure I have anything to offer you. I didn't see anything that could have caused a broken hip. And you can say, I don't know what's relevant either at this point, but what you can do that's so valuable to me is walk me through your shift. And you can start to build those things about appetite, about alertness, about what time they got out of bed, about what time they took a shower, maybe who the second person was who did or didn't come in to help on a lift, or something like that that might help direct your investigation. So when you're talking to folks, you're taking the time to walk them through what they did, what they saw, and what the victim did, how they acted, how they moved about their environment. And it may adjust your timeline. It may give you very valuable information about symptoms that were already there in retrospect. So it's very important that you approach your timeline witnesses by walking them through what they saw and heard and did to see if any of it's relevant later. Collect it and then sort it. Don't dismiss it by asking them, do you know what could have caused this? Because then you've lost any valuable information. So those timeline interviews can be timely, but that's why we're not saying canvass everyone who worked with the person for the last 2 weeks or the last 6 months. We're saying start methodically, one person at a time from discovery and work backwards. And use those interviews to create a repository of the details that they can remember. And don't worry about relevance right now. Whether or not they skipped breakfast or took their meds in the bedroom versus their bedroom, you can sort that out later if you collect it now.
So now you've done all the things that we said to do. You started with your injury, you profiled your injury, you looked and really developed a nice risk profile of your individual, and then you also did some timeline interviews and have all this information. And we're going to talk a little bit now about how you summarize the evidence. And I saw a chat came in, so I don't know if before we go into this, we want to address that because it seems like a nice time prior to moving on.
It's presenter choice. Carrie, can you read it? Do you need my help or you got it?
I can read it. And,
all right, go for it.
We'll tag team it, me and Sarah.
Okay.
I can't help it. I can't not pay attention.
I know you guys are great. Thank you.
How do you establish rapport with a victim who does not want to cooperate with the investigation because of being labeled as a snitch? Do you find it helpful to look at patient behavior for preceding period in order to assess who might have motivation to hurt the patient?
I think it's a great question, and I'm going to tackle it from two different perspectives, two different types of investigations. If someone's not cooperative, and I know this wasn't quite your question, but if someone's not cooperative or not able to cooperate due to functioning level, sometimes the observations in their natural environment, let them think you're there doing other things is fine, and you might gain information. Then to speak specifically to people that don't want to cooperate because of the culture or the repercussions, I think understanding their risk profile might include making it clear what types of challenging behaviors that they have that could potentially trigger someone to be more abusive towards them, whether it's toileting accidents or using racial slurs or using sexual slurs or something like that. If there are things about the victim that could potentially trigger an interaction that may have been witnessed, may not have been witnessed, you want to make sure you're including them in the victim profile. You're also going to be doing a lot of observations about the culture of the environment. Maybe that person isn't willing to sit down with you that first time and say, yeah, so-and-so punched me. But if you've done all this background stuff and there's no way this victim had a seizure and fell in the shower because they didn't even take a shower that day, then their cooperation might, at the end of the day, might not be needed because you might have done all the other steps in such a way that you can say, more likely than not, sometime between 6 and 7:30 a.m. in this part of the building, this occurred as an assault. You may not get to who did it, but you might at least be able to say, hey, there's no way this was a seizure. There was no way that this guy hit himself. I'm going to let Carrie jump in.
Yeah, I think, probably again, not maybe directly on point, but it brought up a lot of thoughts that I had, your question, that we didn't necessarily hit on. But I think looking at the environment and the risk profile also entails looking at, did anybody have exclusive opportunity with your victim at any point in time in the timeline period of when this injury could have occurred? And that's really important information to be able to get and understand. Mm-hmm. And it comes from asking good information, getting good interviews that go beyond, do you know what happened, and getting the routine, to also asking, what does that look like? And again, this comes from working as a team and some of the colleagues on the team. So I showered the victim. what does that look like? So I think you want to make sure when you're investigating and looking at things, you know what that means. When somebody says, I did this, or they did that, they were having a behavior. Well, what does that look like? So I think those things also become very important. And when you start to summarize your evidence to be able to rule in or rule out things. So I think those are two, another important takeaway of who is Jane Doe, and when somebody says something, getting a good idea, well, what does that mean? What does that look like? Is there any opportunity for any kind of an exclusive, when one custodian possibly is with your individual receiving services and nobody else is around, that provides an opportunity where nobody might be able to see or hear anything.
That is such a great point, Carrie. Exclusive opportunity really means you've narrowed down the time frame when the injury could have occurred. And regardless of whether the statements confess to it or not, the subject is the only person who was in the victim's immediate area when it occurred, and you've ruled out self-injury, then you may get to a preponderance in an administrative case. We're not creating a criminal case necessarily from that, but you can say that even if you don't get full cooperation from a victim, that this staff person had exclusive opportunity to cause this injury.
And you add that with a profile of the injury, well supported with medical information that says,
it was caused by a force that had to have been a punch or something like that. Yep.
Not self-inflicted because of the pattern of the injury. You add it all together, and then that's how you build your what more likely than not occurred. And for the most part, when we do look at these and investigate these, we are investigating cases where the victims won't cooperate, but are unable to really participate in the investigation in any meaningful way, because many times they aren't verbal and they can't you can't interview them to find out what happened. So all of these sort of buckets are ways, I think, of interviewing an individual who might not be able to sit down and tell you exactly what happened. So you're assessing all of these buckets to be able to sort of get that and build that sort of interview of the person who might not be able to tell you straight out, hey, this is what happened.
And that makes me think of a very unique type of injury that led us to say more likely than not inflicted. But, we could have reviewed an arm fracture case as if in the old days, folks have been like, they fractured their arm, we couldn't figure out what happened, et cetera, et cetera. But we learned by profiling the star witness that this particular injury is called a nightstick injury, and that the force required to break the bone the way it was broken, more likely than not, the person had to have been protecting their head. That changed the case completely. And it doesn't necessarily mean we had people coming forward and saying, yes, I did X, or no, yes, I was protecting my head. But we had other evidence that got us where we needed to get to, because the injury itself told a story that it didn't have to match what statements were saying. The injury was irrefutable.
So you've done all this great investigative work and you have all this information, and truly injuries of unknown origin are like putting together a puzzle. Like, how do you take all the information that you received and start to sort of assess it and analyze it in a way that supports the leading hypothesis, or can give you a leading hypothesis in a case. I'm going to go back to the tools that you'll get or that we're offered. And the element sheet is very helpful in looking at what you've collected and what bucket can you put it in. Sarah also, I learned a lot of what I know about this from listening to Sarah talk about it. And one of the things that she said is, try to identify the piece of information or evidence you have and what bucket does it go in. Does the medical record, can we use it to profile the injury? Should we put it under there? Where does this timeline interview go? Which bucket does it help us support? And when you can sort of organize your evidence in a logical way according to sort of these three different subcategories, I think it can help you. Summarizing, like, did you have, I think everybody has sort of hypothesis going in of what potentially caused this injury. So now from what you've collected, did it support your kind of original thought, or does it really rule it out? And then if it rules it out, did you have another one that came up? So you want to and the way you're going to really rule in or rule out is describing and offering support for why this is more likely than not, or why, based on what I found, it really isn't likely. So for instance, the injury where somebody has a background of a self-injurious behavior. So immediately I think people think, oh, injury of unknown origin, person with a background with self-injurious behavior, it must have been the cause. Well, now you've gone in and you've done some really good investigative work and you realize that the self-injurious behavior doesn't manifest itself the way the injury was. So typically somebody hits themselves on the leg and they have a bruise on their face. Maybe you have some medical information that tells you probably not inflicted by this individual because the force they hit themselves with typically couldn't have caused this injury. And maybe you have some information on the risk profile, or you've gotten that behavior data that says there was no documented behavior in this period of time that really matches what happens. Well, now you can sort of say, I have enough support to rule that out as my hypothesis. So now what other things can I look at? So I think it's as valuable to coming to a viable hypothesis of ruling things out as it is actually ruling things in. Describe and provide your supporting evidence for what more likely than not caused the injury. You're going again towards another hypothesis of possibly the individual wasn't supervised properly, or staff must have caused the injury due to not creating a lift or doing a lift per policy. And that you really think possibly maybe the individual was lifted or had a lift with one person when two were required. Well, what kinds of things can you use to support that? Well, you'd want to look and make sure the individual's plan said a two-person lift was required. You've done great interviews with people and you know that the individual is lifted with the Hoyer 3 times during the day shift, 2 times during the evening shift, and they're not at all at night shift. So now you can sort of maybe look at, okay, I'm probably not looking at anything that might have happened on the night shift. And now you're looking at, could we match up like the people that would have been involved in the lifts? Did they tell you, oh yeah, when I lifted the person, I asked so-and-so to help me. And you asked that other individual and they said, yep, somebody did ask me to help them. Or maybe they said, nobody ever asked me to help them on that shift. Well, now you're starting to get a little bit of a hypothesis of possibly somebody didn't follow correct lift procedures, and maybe now you're moving your theory into neglect. So it's all about looking at all of this information to be able to support what your possible conclusion may be. And you can also look and have an opportunity to identify systemic concerns and any need for corrective action that might mitigate the risk of future re-injury. Maybe you find that there's something that caused somebody to not ask for help on an evening shift. That might make you relook at, do you need to do something with that shift to change things up so that help is available? So never forgetting there's always opportunities to relook at the systems that you have that can prevent or mitigate a future re-injury in a same or similar manner. Because I think every case, and especially every injury of unknown origin, gives us an opportunity to look at what can we put in place to prevent it from happening again or prevent it from happening to somebody else. And I think there is just as much value in that in looking at the actual case that you have in front of you.
Absolutely. How many times have we learned about water temperatures or about slings that were broken or about, different equipment, seat belts that weren't functioning by good investigations into injuries of unknown origin? Mm-hmm. These tend to get a lot of environmental and systemic staffing improvements for lifting or for challenging behaviors and interactions between staff and persons receiving services. These tend to find systemics.
For training, I think a lot of times you might identify that you really have uncovered some training issues or people really just not being clear on a plan. And so it might really raise some ambiguity in somebody's plan that can be improved and worked on. And I think that's always very valuable. So what we found is that all these tools can help you build a reliable framework, and following the guidelines for the 3 components can really help you gather, sort, analyze your data and your evidence in a way that can help you see relationships between the facts collected and your possible hypothesis to come to something that can help you tell the story of what more likely than not occurred that caused this injury. And it's definitely much more valuable than the generic, do you know what happened? No, I don't, and moving on. Because I don't think anytime we reviewed those types of cases, you really saw, you were left right in the same place that you started. I have an injury and I don't know what happened. And so those almost 100% of the time left you with an injury of unknown origin, where I can say, as we really implemented these types of strategies, we're seeing better and better information come through where we really are able to identify what more likely than not was the cause of these injuries.
And even now, leaving it remains an injury of unknown origin, one of your 5 hypotheses, allows you to close the loop in a different way. Now, on one hand, it sounds like, oh, well, I could get to the bottom doing all this extra work and still have the same conclusion. But the difference is this: if you've done all of this work and the injury still remains suspicious, that's important to document, because if it happens again, we've got a framework built. If it happens again, you have profiled the victim and the injury, and maybe we can narrow down who and when and how it happened even further.
Great job. I always learn something with this presentation. I'm not seeing any questions up. This type of investigation is a little like conducting a failure mode effects analysis.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep. I love all the emojis. That's great. I can tell we've all been Zooming for a while. As we said, this PowerPoint will be shared with everybody along with the handouts. It'll be available on our website. You can always contact us, and we will be sending an evaluation, and we welcome your feedback so that we can provide a summit for you next year that is useful to you.
And I'd really just like to close with saying, take these PowerPoints back to your agency and develop a deeper program. Create guidance documents that maybe help your investigators. If fractures are what you're investigating the most, learn more about fractures, work with your medical director, work with your nursing, and come up with a cheat sheet on when fractures are more suspicious or less suspicious. If you're dealing mostly with bruises, then that's where you start. But use today as a jumping off point to develop a system for your own agency that's going to address the types of IUOs you guys are dealing with. If you're dealing with non-reportables, you're going to handle them one way. If you're dealing with abuse and neglect, you're going to handle them another way. They're mostly fractures or mostly burns or mostly bruises. That's where you should start. But I think, what we gave you today is the type of thing that we turn into full day training, and we've got pages and pages of additional guidance for our investigators for those very reasons, because this takes a lot of work. And I think the more you're able to set your investigators up for success, the better they'll be.
There's one last question. Are these, trainings available to share? Yes, please do share them with people who couldn't attend. They will be on our, like I said, they'll be on our website, so anybody can watch them at any time. And yes, well, congratulations. We've just created another Sherlock Holmes. So that's awesome.
So after this training, we hope that a few more of you will become as passionate about IUO investigations as we are.
There really is satisfaction to saying, hey, I don't know exactly what caused this injury, but by all the information I've gathered, I'm pretty confident that this more likely than not did, and I don't have any, big issue going on where somebody is being abused or neglected and I didn't identify it. So, and I think these tools give you a really good outcome.
And if you're starting with that IUO as a non-reportable and you start to feel it's suspicious, you report it. And you'll get the resources to investigate it that way. I think sometimes people don't report injuries because it didn't require more than first aid or it didn't require a hospitalization. But if it's a black eye and a chipped tooth that wasn't there when you put them to bed and it was there when you woke them up in the morning, give us a call.
All right, everybody. This has been great. It's great to see so much enthusiasm for the participants too. I think that speaks volumes about New York's service sector and your dedication. So thanks for taking the time and attending. And thank you, Carrie and Sarah, very much. And we'll see you at next year's summit.
Take care.
Thanks.
All right. Bye.